Welcome back to Problem Solver Politics. I'm your host, Cardin Ellis, with Cody the Oracle.
Hey, everyone.
And a lot of people have kind of been asking us, do you think America's, quote, ready to vote for an Asian president? And I thought it was kind of an interesting question, the term ready, as though, I don't know. To me, I just think, yeah, of course we're ready. At least millennials are. We live in a meritocracy. We haven't cared. That's only like boomers and stuff. But anyway, it is interesting diving into the data of Asian Americans, the Asian American electorate, and whether or not Asian Americans generally favor Democrat or Republican candidates, and how, in my opinion, they are woefully overlooked in American politics. And there's some real census data and election data to prove this. So before we get started, I'll just point out, this reminds me very much of, in 1960, the big WASPy question for all the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants was, what are we going to do with this Irish Catholic? And a lot of people say, oh, that was kind of like prejudice or, anti-religious, nearly racism, right? But when in reality, the big question amongst many of the pastors of the time was, well, you guys have a pope. And popes weigh in on moral questions, and oftentimes moral questions are political questions. And if you really believe the pope is the vicar of Christ on earth, will you be following the will of the pope more or the people more? And that was a reservation that a lot of people had, which is a really interesting moral question to ask about somebody who's going to become the leader of the free world. So if you could pull up this clip really fast, Cody, he actually, I believe it was at the Rice Hotel, if I'm not mistaken, in Houston, Texas, brought most of the biggest pastors of the time of all of these Protestant faiths together to actually give a speech where he pretty much pledged allegiance to the United States of America, saying any kind of influence from the Pope would be welcome as wise advice, but would be considered inappropriate as political direction, and basically won over the whole entire audience, and they all loved him, and they ended up becoming one of the most resoundingly popular presidents of all time. So I think right now we're actually kind of noticing a similar situation just by virtue of the fact that I was asked the question I was asked. And we're going to bring up two articles here. One from the Washington Post and also Gallup data. Okay. When Mitt Romney ran, there was a very similar question. Is America, quote, ready to vote for a Mormon or a member of the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints? And there was a lot of data on phone polls about people's perceptions towards such. So first, we're going to go back to actually the Gallup poll. And when polled about the presidency, and some of these polling questions go back to the 1950s, all right, the simple question was asked, if your party nominated a, quote, generally well-qualified person for president who happened to be blank, would you vote for that person? And the following was filled in. Would you vote for a well-qualified candidate that was Jewish? Would you vote for one that was an atheist, one that was black, one that was Catholic, one that was gay or lesbian, a woman, Hispanic, Muslim, a socialist, an evangelical Christian over the age of 70, most recently, probably for AOC, under the age of 40, and then finally Mormon? What I found hilarious, Cody, about this whole study is that since, and some of these go back to 1937, they were asking, would you vote for a Catholic president back in 1937, and in 1958 asking about a black, or in 1937, a Jewish president, all the way up until 67, 69, 2012, 2017. But nowhere in this list is Asian, even though they represent a huge chunk, almost a tithe of our population. Almost a tenth of our population, somewhere officially around about 6% of our population is Asian. Yet they were asking, would you vote for a Hispanic for president long before Hispanics had a bigger market share, shall we say?
Well, I mean, 2007 is really not that long ago.
Well, yeah, of that specific question, yes. But I'm talking about some of these questions date back to the 30s. I mean, we never had a 6% population of Jews.
No, it's still been 12 years since they basically asked about every large ethnic group in the nation, and they left Asian off, which it is weird. As you can see, they added a Muslim in 2012, a socialist in 2015, so they've expanded over the years. But it's funny. I mean, 5% of the U.S. population is, I believe, Asian, right? Or 9%, I believe?
It's 5.6 according to the census of people that just purely identify just as Asian. And there's about another 2% of people that are mixed race that it could be considered partly Asian. And then another less than 1% of people that kind of draw the line between Asian Pacific Islander and so on and so forth, right? So it's safe to say less than 10%. But my question here, and what kind of stood out to me was, isn't it kind of odd that, for example, they've been asking, would you vote for a Mormon for decades, even though Mormons are less than 1% of the population of America, yet Asians who are 6 times that, they're not even asking the question, which to me would be evidence of the fact that they never thought it was possible or would happen, or there had to have been some kind of bias there, because scientifically it's unavoidable the percentage of America that has been Asian for multiple decades. This isn't like, you know, a new demographic that just popped up. I mean, we had heavy swaths of Japanese people building railroads in the Western United States throughout the 1800s.
Yeah, well, Chinese mostly as well.
Oh yeah, sorry, you're right. Chinese. I apologize. So anyway, we're now going to head over to the Washington Post.
Well, one thing I want to share really quickly, as you were speaking about earlier, I mean, just in general, I think any group of people in this country, like, it doesn't make any sense for a politician not to address that group on some level. And any political party, you think any group, regardless of 1%, is something. Those are people in the country, they're citizens, you know, stuff kind of matters. Well, this is fascinating to me. According to, this is an article from USA Today, in 2018 or 16, 2018 exit polling showed that 77% of Asian Americans voted for Democrats. Which is kind of interesting to me. Again, a very large voter broke, but I think that's one thing, though, I've noticed in general, the Democratic Party, and probably both parties do this, but they take for granted voter blocks. I mean, if 6% of the population votes for you 77% of the time in the last election, that's something to recognize. Those are citizens. Those are your constituents, the people you represent. You know what I mean? So it is weird to see so little. In this article, they do mention that in the 2020 election, I believe there's a representative they speak with, Mrs. Meng, and she says that they seem to be getting a little bit more response from the party. But still, yeah, you would think a demographic that large and a group of people that big that have, you know, a say in these elections, that are citizens of the nation. It is weird to see so little emphasis put to the point where Gallup hasn't even bothered to ask. Another thing that's kind of fascinating, if you look at the numbers in that Gallup poll, since the 70s, for pretty much every question they asked, it's about 80% average of people who would vote for you. You realize it hasn't been a while.
Nobody's cared for 60 years.
It's been a while since you would see like a 30. Like I think if someone they asked if you vote for a woman in 1937, it was very low. But I mean, like since the 70s, it's actually been pretty high. Worth noting, since the 70s, the only president we've had that would be Barack Obama. Everyone else would be fairly similar to or related. You know what I mean? So it's like,
you mean they'd look a lot like Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Hickenlooper, Buttigieg?
No, exactly. Yes, that's what I mean.
Okay.
It's not an old or new problem. I'm just saying it is kind of interesting to see that people have been open to it for 30 years. But I think the big thing there, though, and I don't want to spoil too much here, but I don't know if America, quote unquote, would ever be ready to vote for any. America was ready to vote for Barack Obama. Like, it didn't matter what race he was, I don't think, at that point. They were ready to vote for a candidate like him.
Well, and a mule could have run against George Bush with how unpopular the media had
But even
made
aside
him.
that, I have so many family members that were Republicans that voted for Obama because they believed in him and liked him. Like, I think America's always ready for the right candidate.
I argued on Obama's behalf many a time with my grandparents, actually. It was really funny. And I actually remember writing in my journal when Barack Obama was elected. I had not voted for him. I'd actually voted for Ron Paul in that election. I'd gone libertarian.
Grassroots?
Yeah, grassroots. Revolution with the love spelled backwards. But anyway, I do remember saying, hey, there's a positive feeling in the air. Power 106 here in Los Angeles was blasting Tupac's line about America one day having a black president, and there was a lot of positivity. Of course, it ended not how it started, but I do remember there being that positivity there. Okay, so anyway, this David Byler, author of this Washington Post article, brings up some really intriguing points that I thought was worth investigating, because yes, I agree with you, Cody. The Democrat Party has a huge problem of taking entire demographics for granted. One of them was the white blue-collar worker, which shifted wildly towards Trump. And that makes sense because they had stopped courting these demographics. And even Ethan Smith on ESPN said something very wise. He says, I don't understand why we vote 98% Democrat. How can we complain that we are a marginalized people that are not represented in government properly when we vote almost 100% of the time with one party? That sends a message to the Democrats that, hey, you don't have to work for our votes. Don't worry about us. And then it sends a message to the Republicans that, hey, you can't get our votes. Don't worry about us. So how can we say we're marginalized? In the case of Asians, I don't think it's as ideological as much as David Byler brings up a really interesting point here, geographical. Okay? And what he says is basically, here's the principal demographics of the Democrats: blue collar white Democrats who ended up voting for Trump, women who fueled the suburban revolt of 2018, black voters who in high turnouts helped re-elect and elect the first time Donald Trump, and the quote long awaited Latino surge. However, Asian American voters, despite being the fourth largest racial group in the United States, and having a very quickly growing American population, faster than any other ethnic group, and despite being wildly Democrat, 65% of Asian Americans are Democrats or lean towards the Democrat Party, while only 27% identify as Republican, they're often relegated to, quote, at best, a footnote in conversations about national politics. And then he brings up an extremely interesting point. The vast majority of Asian Americans live in the following states: California, Oregon, Washington, wildly Democrat, never going to flip those. Okay, Illinois, good luck doing anything Republican there. Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, D.C., New York City, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, with the exception of Alaska and Nevada, which is indeed a swing state. And then I believe some people would consider one of those on the eastern seaboard an actual swing state. They're kind of crunched into, and Hawaii, of course, which has the highest percentage. They're kind of crunched into states where it's like, we don't need you. You know, we don't need to court you. We don't need to specify you. However, I think there's actually a surge on the Republican side because we're seeing tons of, especially Korean American candidates here, surging in California. For example, down in Orange County, there was the famous case of what was going to be Representative Kim, who actually won her election. But then when all the harvested ballots came in, they actually had to bring her back from Washington and say, actually, you lost once we counted all the mail-in ballots. And now your competitor's going to Washington. But she did all of her press conferences in both English and in Korean. So I definitely think that to maintain relevance, the Republicans have to go after more of the Asian population. And I don't think they're necessarily just in the bag for somebody like Yang just because he is Asian. And I do think America's ready, whatever that means, because we never cared in the first place. I think it's kind of a stupid premise. But it was the excuse to dive into the data on Asian Americans here. And I have noticed the Yang Gang is wildly diverse. But we have noticed an inordinate excitement level on behalf of Asians. Some of our first donors were actually Asian, if we want to be judgmental by the names we couldn't pronounce. You know what I'm saying? And they're totally awesome, and they engage like crazy on all of our forums and all of our chat rooms. So I thought it was interesting seeing what all the data suggested about how parties kind of use and court this demographic and how it's risen as one of the most successful financial stories in America, but not one of the most successful political stories in terms of representation. Because, like, for example, Mormons, less than 1% of the population, are 2 to 3% of Congress. You know, like 4% of the military, wildly overrepresented in most branches of government. And so, I don't know if you necessarily notice that exact same phenomenon on the Asian side, but here it's suggested it's actually geographic and not necessarily ideological. Am I going wrong here, Cody?
Well, I mean, it is also tough to say, especially us living where we do in the Los Angeles area. I believe Los Angeles is like the third or fourth largest Korean population outside of Korea. I believe San Jose is one of the largest Filipino populations outside of the Philippines as well.
Yeah, we have more Ecuadorians that live here than live in Ecuador now.
No, my point being though, it is kind of different for people in California because, like I said, like there is they're a larger share of the percent of people in California. other parts of the country. I mean, like you look, and as you could say, kind of geographically, there's a giant area in the Midwest. But again, like I don't think any political party should take any demographic for granted. It's kind of ridiculous to me when you think about it. 2% of the population, that's enough people. We're talking a large enough volume of people where it's like, you should probably hear them out, figure out what their issues are, and work with them.
Yeah.
It is weird to me that, for example, I just said Gallup hasn't even bothered to ask in 70 years. Now, like I said, they didn't ask Hispanic until 2007. I don't think Muslim until 2012. But still, I mean, we're still waiting for 6% of the population to get some representation in this poll as far as would you vote for a president from this descent. Also, I brought it up before. One of the things, I've noticed difference between America and Europe. Europeans, when they say Asia, they generally refer to the entire continent, all the way to like India and Pakistan and stuff. Whereas Americans generally think of Asia as just kind of like the far Eastern Asia, China, Southeast Asia, Korea, Japan, stuff like that. So that's the other thing that's interesting to me too. They leave off Asian. They don't ask about any other. They don't ask about like the Indian subcontinent. They really just do leave off a very large portion of the planet in those polls, but.
Well, the fact that the Gallup poll did leave out Asians, to me, it doesn't make sense, though, because since the 30s, they were asking, would you vote for a president that is Jewish? Yet historically, Jews have only been 1 to 2% of America. I mean, I looked it up right now, and currently they're at 1.4% of the American population. So it's like, why are they asking about a 1.4% of the American population? You know what I'm saying? While they're leaving out the 6%.
Yeah.
Why are they asking about Mormons, the 0.8%?
Yeah, we brought it up before as well. There's the scandal going on, I believe, at Harvard with admissions, where they actually would dock you
these
for
guys
being
are getting
Asian
the shaft, man.
Well, no, but this people brought up in the comments before, and I do wonder if part of the kind of more progressive identitarian left movement, Asians in a lot of ways do kind of disprove some of their arguments. Because like you said, 6% is a minority group. They're one of the smaller minorities in the nation. And by and large, Asians do very well. They do very well in testing when it comes to getting into colleges. They do very well financially. They're very successful people. So it's a lot of the arguments for a lot of the kind of more progressive identitarian movements. They have to kind of, like I said, in the case of Harvard, punish Asians, which I think is really unfair. And I think that's one thing that you kind of have to bring it up, because people brought it up in the comments before. I'm like, yeah, like you look and it's like realistically, like why aren't they championing this ethnic group that, comes from, like I said, Asia's a very big place. When you say Asian, you're speaking of people in India, you're speaking of people in Southeast Asia, people in Japan that have been doing very well in this country, opening businesses, becoming, politicians. I mean, look at the heads of a lot of these tech companies. A lot of people from India and other parts of like what would be considered Asia. So it is really weird to see that entire continent just kind of left out in the political discussion currently in America. It's really weird to me, as you kind of more you think about it, that they is a very large group of people. It's just kind of left out. We just don't talk about them. Yeah. As far as racial groups, it's like, well, there's kind of like a couple, and we don't talk about Asians. It is weird.
They just got to move. Apparently, they just have to have a mass exodus to swing states, and they will get courted.
Those are the most densely populated states. I mean, if you're talking about states people in general live in, outside of Texas, Florida, those are generally speaking the states people live in, California, Look, New York.
If Asians want to control America, they just got to move to Des Moines, Iowa, and New Hampshire, those first states that caucus in the presidential election, and they will swing American politics for the next 2 decades. Am I right?
No, but like I said, one thing you can look right now, like by and large, people of Asian descent are very successful in this country. You could say they're already kind of, I don't know if they were taking over, but yeah, like it's an ethnic group that's doing very well right now.
It's a wildly successful American dream story, and I think, general Asian migration in the United States.
I mean, I believe the only non-white owner of an NFL team, I believe, would be considered of Asian descent. Like, just there we go. I think he's Indian. Don't quote me on that, but I believe he's from India. So yeah, it is a little bit frustrating sometimes. Like I said, we grew up in Los Angeles. I've always known a bunch of people, mostly
we're the minority, man.
Well, no, not like that. But I'm just saying that I know a lot of Koreans.
We're less than
mainly Koreans 29%. Out here, and it is kind of interesting to me that you see, like, when it comes to politics, by and large, they really do just kind of get ignored. Yeah. No one bothers to even kind of pander to them. Like, there's nothing. It's like they literally are left out of the discussion. That is kind of I don't know the word for it, unfair, but it's just bizarre. I don't know why you would leave.
Bizarre, yes.
Why leave a group of people like that just out of the discussion? It's only just, I don't get it.
To me, it does not make sense. I would court them like crazy if I were a Republican in charge of the RNC, or if I were a Democrat in charge of the DNC. Anyway, we'd love to know what you guys think. Please give us your opinion. Do you think Asians are treated, quote, fairly? Do you think America's ready for an Asian president? So on and so forth. Like, opine, subscribe, share, please. This is Problem Solver Politics.